The First World War began with a belief in speed, in decisive movement, and the crushing power of the offense. But on the vast, unforgiving plains of the Eastern Front, those beliefs would be utterly shattered. This is the story of the massive Russian steamroller rolling into East Prussia, confident and overwhelming. But confidence is cheap, and intelligence is everything. Today, we witness a catastrophic strategic blunder, a victory so complete, it would define careers and determine the destiny of an entire empire. This is the Battle of Tannenberg. In the late summer of 1914, while the world's attention was focused on the German armies sweeping through Belgium and France toward Paris, another massive conflict was unfolding in the east. Here, on the flat, lake-studded plains of East Prussia, a catastrophe was taking shape, a disaster so complete, so devastating, that it would destroy an entire army and send shockwaves through the Russian Empire. This is the story of Tannenberg, a battle that would last just 5 days. A battle that would claim over 170,000 Russian casualties. A battle that would create legends and break the spirits of hundreds of thousands of men. And a battle that would reveal, with brutal clarity, the fatal flaws in Russia's military machine. To understand Tannenberg, we must first understand the strategic nightmare that had haunted German military planners for decades, the prospect of fighting a two-front war. Germany sat in the heart of Europe, bordered by France to the west and Russia to the east. In any major European conflict, Germany would face enemies on both sides, forcing it to divide its armies and fight simultaneous campaigns separated by hundreds of miles. The German solution, embodied in the Schlieffen Plan, was to knock France out of the war quickly with a massive offensive in the west, then turn the full weight of German military power eastward to deal with Russia. The plan assumed that Russia, with its vast distances, poor roads, and notorious bureaucratic inefficiency, would take weeks or even months to mobilize its armies. Germany would have time to defeat France before the Russian threat became critical. But German planners had underestimated their eastern neighbor. Russia might be backward, but it was also determined to prove itself a great power. And when the war began in August 1914, Russia moved with unexpected speed. The Russian Empire commanded the largest standing army in the world, the Russian steamroller, as it was known in Western Europe. Millions of soldiers, tough peasant conscripts hardened by a lifetime of poverty and privation, loyal to the Tsar and Mother Russia. If these masses could be properly organized, properly led, properly supplied, they would be unstoppable. They would simply overwhelm any opponent through sheer weight of numbers. But there was a problem. The Russian military establishment was riddled with incompetence, corruption, and outdated thinking. Its officer corps was dominated by aristocrats who owed their positions to birth rather than merit. Its logistics were primitive. Its communications were chaotic. And its high command was paralyzed by rivalries and bureaucratic infighting. These weaknesses would be laid bare at Tannenberg. When Germany declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914, the Russian response was swift. Tsar Nicholas II had promised his French allies that Russia would launch an offensive against Germany within 15 days of mobilization, an astonishingly short timeline for an empire as vast and disorganized as Russia. But the Tsar was determined to keep his promise. France was under enormous pressure from the German offensive in the west. Russia had to attack, had to draw German forces eastward, had to relieve the pressure on its ally. The Russian plan called for a two-pronged invasion of German territory. Two armies would converge on East Prussia from different directions, like a giant pincer closing around the province. From the east would come the Russian First Army, commanded by General Pavel Rennenkampf, approximately 200,000 men strong. From the south would come the Second Army under General Alexander Samsonov, another 200,000 troops. The two armies would advance, meet somewhere in the middle of East Prussia, trap the German defenders between them, and crush them. On paper, it looked straightforward. In reality, it was a recipe for disaster. The two Russian commanders could hardly have been more different or more mutually hostile. Rennenkampf was a cavalry officer of German Baltic extraction, cold, aristocratic, and cautious. Samsonov was an infantry general, more aggressive but also less sophisticated in his understanding of modern warfare. The two men despised each other, a hatred that dated back to the Russo-Japanese War a decade earlier, when they had reportedly come to blows on a railway platform in full view of their troops. Now they were expected to coordinate their movements across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain with no love lost between them. Making matters worse was the geography of East Prussia itself. The province was a landscape of forests, lakes, and marshes, the Masurian Lakes region, a natural obstacle that separated the two Russian armies and made coordination between them exceptionally difficult. Rennenkampf's First Army would have to march west, then south. Samsonov's Second Army would have to march north. They would be separated by dozens of miles of lakes and swamps, unable to support each other if either ran into trouble. The German forces defending East Prussia were vastly outnumbered. General Max von Prittwitz commanded the German 8th Army, approximately 135,000 men facing nearly 400,000 Russians advancing from two directions. Prittwitz was a competent but uninspiring officer, and as the Russian armies began their advance in mid-August, he faced an agonizing decision: how to defend an entire province against overwhelming odds. On August 17th, Rennenkampf's First Army crossed the border into East Prussia. German forces attempted to slow the Russian advance at Stallupönen on August 17th, launching a spoiling attack that inflicted heavy casualties on the Russians but failed to stop them. 3 days later, at Gumbinnen on August 20th, Prittwitz attempted a larger assault against Rennenkampf's advancing forces. The results were mixed at best. Some German units succeeded in their attacks. Others were thrown back with heavy losses. Russian artillery, particularly their heavy guns, proved devastatingly effective. By the end of the day, Prittwitz had lost thousands of men and failed to halt the Russian advance. And now came alarming news from the south. Samsonov's Second Army had crossed the border and was advancing northward into East Prussia. Prittwitz faced the nightmare scenario: two massive Russian armies converging on his position from different directions. If he remained where he was, fighting Rennenkampf, Samsonov would march unopposed into the heart of East Prussia and cut off the German retreat. If he moved south to confront Samsonov, Rennenkampf would have a free hand in the north. Prittwitz, shaken by the heavy casualties at Gumbinnen and overwhelmed by the strategic situation, made a fateful telephone call to German headquarters far to the west. He suggested that the 8th Army should abandon East Prussia entirely and withdraw behind the Vistula River, over 100 miles to the west, to avoid being trapped between the two Russian armies. It was a suggestion that would cost him his command and change the course of the battle and the war. At German headquarters in Koblenz, far from the fighting in East Prussia, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, chief of the German General Staff, received Prittwitz's message with alarm bordering on panic. Abandon East Prussia? Retreat behind the Vistula? This was unthinkable. East Prussia was the heartland of Prussian militarism, the cradle of the German Empire. To surrender it to the Russians without a decisive battle would be a catastrophic blow to German morale and prestige. Moreover, Moltke was already under enormous strain. His great offensive in France was not proceeding as smoothly as planned. Now he faced a potential disaster in the east as well. He made an immediate decision. Prittwitz had to go. A new commander was needed, someone with nerve, someone with imagination, someone who would fight rather than retreat. The man Moltke chose was Paul von Hindenburg, and the choice was remarkable. Hindenburg was 66 years old, a retired general who had left active service years earlier. He was living quietly in retirement in Hanover when, on August 22, 1914, he received a telegram recalling him to duty. Hindenburg was old, but he was also a Prussian to his core, stoic, dutiful, and possessed of an unshakable calm under pressure. More importantly, he knew East Prussia intimately, having participated in staff exercises in the region for years. But Hindenburg would not command alone. Moltke paired him with a chief of staff, a younger officer who would provide the energy and operational brilliance that the mission required. His name was Erich Ludendorff, and he was already becoming a hero of the war. Ludendorff had just achieved fame as the officer who had led the successful assault on the Belgian fortress of Liège, one of Germany's first victories of the war. He was 49 years old, intense, driven, a master of military logistics and planning. Where Hindenburg was calm and methodical, Ludendorff was aggressive and dynamic. Together, they would form one of the most famous military partnerships in history. On August 23, Hindenburg and Ludendorff boarded separate trains heading east toward the fighting. They met for the first time on a railway platform and immediately began planning their campaign. By the time their trains reached East Prussia, they had already outlined a bold strategy, a strategy that had, in fact, been proposed by staff officers already on the scene, particularly Colonel Max Hoffmann, who would play a crucial role as operations officer. The plan was audacious, even reckless. Instead of trying to fight both Russian armies simultaneously or retreating as Prittwitz had suggested, the Germans would concentrate their forces against Samsonov's Second Army in the south. They would leave only a minimal screening force, cavalry, and a single infantry corps to delay Rennenkampf's First Army in the north. The rest of the Eighth Army would shift rapidly southward by rail and on foot to surround and destroy Samsonov before Rennenkampf could intervene. It was a tremendous gamble. If Rennenkampf advanced aggressively while the Germans were moving south, he could march virtually unopposed deep into East Prussia, cutting German supply lines and threatening the rear of the forces engaged with Samsonov. Everything depended on Rennenkampf moving slowly, on him giving the Germans time to concentrate against Samsonov, win a decisive victory, and then turn back north to deal with the First Army. But Hindenburg and Ludendorff had reason for confidence, and that reason lay in one of the most extraordinary intelligence advantages any commander has ever enjoyed in war. The Russians were transmitting their orders, their positions, their movements, virtually every detail of their operations, by radio in uncoded, plain language messages that German wireless intercept stations could receive and read as easily as if they were reading a newspaper. It seems almost impossible to believe. The Russian military had wireless equipment, but it was in short supply, and Russian operators were poorly trained. More critically, the Russian command seemed to have an almost willful disregard for security. Orders were sent in clear text. Detailed reports of unit positions and strengths were transmitted openly. Even messages detailing planned movements and objectives were broadcast without encryption. The Germans could hardly believe their luck. Every evening, German intelligence officers presented Hindenburg and Ludendorff with transcripts of Russian radio messages. They knew where the Russian armies were. They knew where they were going. They knew their supply situation, their casualties, even the mounting tensions between Rennenkampf and Samsonov. It was as if the Russian commanders were handing the Germans a complete map of their operations. Armed with this intelligence, Hindenburg and Ludendorff set their plan in motion. German units began boarding trains on August 23rd and 24th, heading south toward the positions held by Samsonov's Second Army. Others marched on foot, moving day and night to reach their positions. The German rail network, efficient and well organized, allowed the movement of entire divisions with remarkable speed. Meanwhile, Samsonov's Second Army was advancing northward, deeper into East Prussia. Samsonov was under tremendous pressure from his superior, General Yakov Zelinsky, commander of the Northwestern Front, to maintain the offensive. Zelensky, in turn, was under pressure from the Russian High Command to achieve quick victories to aid the French. There could be no delay, no caution, no waiting for supplies or rest. The advance must continue. But Samsonov's army was already in trouble. His soldiers had been marching for days across difficult terrain. Supply wagons struggled to keep pace over poor roads. Food was running short. Ammunition stocks were low. Men were exhausted, marching in oppressive August heat with little rest. And all the while, Samsonov was moving deeper into unfamiliar territory with only the vaguest idea of where the German forces actually were. Samsonov's intelligence was catastrophically poor. Russian reconnaissance was almost non-existent. Cavalry screens that should have been scouting ahead and on the flanks were either absent or failed to report what they saw. Samsonov believed, because his superiors told him to believe, that the Germans were retreating, falling back before the Russian advance. He had no idea that German forces were actually concentrating on his flanks, preparing to encircle him. And where was Rennenkampf? Where was the First Army that was supposed to be advancing from the north, supporting Samsonov's movement, threatening to trap the Germans between the two Russian armies? Rennenkampf was moving slowly, very slowly. After the fighting at Gumbinnen, he had paused to rest his troops and reorganize. His supply situation was poor. His cavalry commander had been killed, and he seems to have convinced himself that the Germans were beaten, that they were retreating before him, that there was no need for urgency. He advanced cautiously, methodically, giving the Germans exactly what they needed: time. Some historians have suggested that Rennenkampf deliberately dragged his feet, that his hatred of Samsonov made him unwilling to risk his own army to help his rival. Others point to simple incompetence, overcaution, and poor intelligence. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The Russian First Army, which should have been the hammer driving the Germans into Samsonov's anvil, was instead moving too slowly to affect the battle that was about to unfold. By August 25th, the pieces were in place. Samsonov's Second Army, 5 corps spread across a front of nearly 60 miles, was advancing northward through the lake country south of the small town of Allenstein. The Russian center and left wing were pushing forward aggressively. But on the Russian right flank and left flank, German forces were moving into position. On the Russian right, General Hermann von François' I Corps was preparing to attack from the west. On the Russian left, General Otto von Below's I Reserve Corps was moving into position from the east. And in the center, German forces were preparing to hold the Russian advance, to serve as the anvil against which the flanking corps would hammer the Russians. Samsonov, advancing deeper into the trap, still believed he was pursuing a retreating enemy. He sent optimistic messages to headquarters, reporting that German resistance was weakening, that victory was within reach. He drove his exhausted troops forward, toward the forests and lakes around the historic medieval battlefield of Tannenberg, a name that would soon be written in blood. On August 26th, the trap began to close. The Battle of Tannenberg had begun, though Samsonov did not yet realize that he was not the hunter, but the hunted. August 26, 1914. The morning dawned hot and clear across the plains and forests of southern East Prussia. General Samsonov's Second Army was spread across a vast front, its 5 corps pushing northward in what he believed was a pursuit of retreating German forces. But the Germans were not retreating. They were attacking. On the Russian right flank, near the town of Ustaw, General Hermann von François' I Corps slammed into the Russian 6th Corps with devastating force. François, an aggressive and sometimes insubordinate officer, had been ordered to wait for more ammunition to arrive before attacking. He attacked anyway, convinced that speed and surprise were more important than waiting for perfect logistics. The Russian 6th Corps, commanded by General Blagoveschenski, was caught off guard. Francois' artillery opened fire at dawn, catching Russian units still in their bivouacs. German infantry advanced rapidly, exploiting the shock and confusion. The Russians fought back desperately, but they were outmaneuvered and outgunned. By the end of the day, the Russian Sixth Corps was in retreat, its cohesion shattered, pulling back southward away from the rest of Samsonov's army. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the Russian line, the left flank, another German assault was developing. General Otto von Below's I Reserve Corps was moving against the Russian I Corps under General Artemanov. Here too, the Russian flank crumbled under the German attack. Artemanov's corps, undermanned and poorly positioned, fell back in disorder. Within a single day, both of Samsonov's flanks had been broken. The German pincer was beginning to close. But Samsonov, at his headquarters far behind the front lines, did not yet grasp the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him. This was one of the great tragedies of Tannenberg, the complete breakdown of Russian communications and intelligence. Samsonov had almost no reliable information about what was happening to his army. Reports from the front were delayed by hours or even days. Officers sent to investigate failed to return or returned with conflicting accounts. Telephone lines, strung hastily as the army advanced, frequently broke down. Wireless communications were sporadic and often garbled. Samsonov did not know that his flanks had collapsed. He did not know that German forces were moving around his army in a massive envelopment. He did not know, could not know, that he was marching his center corps deeper into a trap. His superior, General Zelensky, was even more ignorant of the true situation. From his headquarters hundreds of miles to the rear, Zelensky continued to send optimistic orders: advance, attack, pursue the enemy. He dismissed reports of German attacks on the flanks as exaggerations. The Germans were beaten, he insisted. Keep moving forward. On August 27th and 28th, the battle intensified across the entire front. In the center of the Russian line, Samsonov's 13th, 15th, and 23rd Corps pushed forward, engaging German forces in heavy fighting around the villages of Allenstein and Hohenstein. These Russian units, the cream of the Second Army, fought with tremendous courage and tenacity. They did not know they were surrounded. They did not know that their supply lines were being cut. They advanced, attacked, and died believing that victory was still possible. The Germans in the center, though outnumbered, held their positions. They did not need to win decisively here. They only needed to hold, to keep the Russian Center Corps engaged while the flanking movements continued. Every hour the Russians spent fighting in the center was another hour for the German pincer to close more tightly around them. On the flanks, the situation was becoming catastrophic. Francois' corps on the western flank had continued its advance, driving the shattered remnants of the Russian Sixth Corps before it. By August 28th, Francois' forces had reached Hindenburg, directly south of the main Russian position. They were now behind Samsonov's army, cutting the roads and railways that connected the Russian forces to their supplies and reinforcements. On the eastern flank, Below's corps had similarly driven back the Russian I Corps and was now wheeling westward, closing the other arm of the pincer. The gap between Francois and Below was shrinking rapidly. When it closed completely, 3 entire Russian corps, over 100,000 men, would be trapped inside a ring of German steel. The fate of battles often turns on such moments when commanders must recognize that their plans have failed, that their assumptions were wrong, that survival depends on abandoning their objectives and retreating while retreat is still possible. Samsonov faced such a moment on August 28th, as fragmentary reports finally began to reach his headquarters suggesting that the situation was far worse than anyone had realized. But Samsonov could not bring himself to order a general retreat. He was a soldier of the old school, trained to value courage and offensive spirit above all else. To retreat without explicit orders from his superiors seemed like cowardice. Moreover, he still hoped, desperately hoped, that Rennenkampf's First Army would arrive from the north and relieve the pressure on the Second Army. Rennenkampf was not coming. The First Army was still advancing slowly, cautiously, miles away from the battlefield. Whether through incompetence, overcaution, or deliberate indifference, Rennenkampf would not arrive in time to save Samsonov. On August 29th, the final day of the battle proper, the German pincer closed completely. François' corps advancing from the west met Belot's corps advancing from the east at Willenburg, south of the Russian positions. The trap was shut. 3 Russian corps, the 13th, 15th, and part of the 23rd, were completely surrounded in the forests around Tannenberg. What followed was not so much a battle as a massacre. The surrounded Russian units, running low on ammunition, food, and water, attempted to break out. They launched desperate attacks against the German encirclement. They fought in the dense forests where artillery was useless and visibility was measured in yards. Some units tried to surrender but were cut down because the Germans, in the chaos and fear of close-quarters combat, could not always distinguish surrender from resistance. Entire regiments were annihilated. Columns of Russian soldiers, trying to escape through the forest paths, were caught by German machine gun fire and artillery. Others, separated from their units and lost in the woods, wandered aimlessly until they were captured or killed. The forest floor was carpeted with bodies. The streams ran red. General Samsonov, finally understanding the magnitude of the catastrophe, left his headquarters and rode forward to try to reach his trapped corps, to take personal command, to do something, anything, to salvage the situation. But there was nothing he could do. His army was destroyed. His soldiers were dying or surrendering by the tens of thousands. The Second Army, which had crossed into East Prussia just 2 weeks earlier with such confidence, no longer existed as a fighting force. On the night of August 29th, somewhere in the dark forests south of Willenburg, General Alexander Samsonov walked away from his surviving staff officers. He told them he was going for a moment of privacy. He did not return. His body was found months later. He had shot himself. Unable to face the destruction of his army, the deaths of tens of thousands of his soldiers, and the disgrace of such a catastrophic defeat, Samsonov had chosen suicide. He was 65 years old, a career soldier who had served the Tsar faithfully for decades. The Battle of Tannenberg had broken him utterly. By August 30th, the battle was effectively over. Small groups of Russian soldiers were still trying to escape through the forests, and German units were still rounding up prisoners, but the Second Army had ceased to exist as an organized military force. The Germans had achieved one of the most complete tactical victories in military history. The question that would be asked for decades afterward was simple. How had it happened? How had a Russian army of over 150,000 men been destroyed in less than a week by a German force that was actually smaller in total numbers? The answers were many. The Russian communications failures, the fatal decision to split their forces between 2 non-supporting armies, Samsonov's poor intelligence and inability to recognize the trap closing around him, the personal rivalry between Samsonov and Rennenkampf, the German advantage in rail transportation, the brilliant use of intercepted Russian radio messages, all these factors contributed to the disaster. But perhaps most important was leadership. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, supported by capable staff officers like Max Hoffmann, had taken an enormous risk and executed their plan with speed and precision. They had been bold where the Russians were cautious, aggressive where the Russians were confused, united where the Russians were divided. The Battle of Tannenberg was a masterpiece of military art, and a warning of how completely modern warfare could destroy armies that failed to adapt to its demands. When the smoke cleared and the final counts were tallied, the scale of the Russian disaster at Tannenberg became apparent. The numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. Over 170,000 Russian soldiers were casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Of these, approximately 50,000 were dead or wounded, and an astonishing 120,000 were taken prisoner. Entire divisions had been destroyed. 3 corps commanders were captured. General Samsonov himself was dead by his own hand. The Russian Second Army had simply ceased to exist. German casualties, by contrast, were remarkably light, approximately 12,000 to 15,000 killed and wounded. The disparity was almost unbelievable, a casualty ratio of more than 10 to 1. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the history of modern warfare. The immediate military consequences were profound. East Prussia was saved. The Russian invasion had been not merely stopped but annihilated. The German Eighth Army, far from being forced to retreat behind the Vistula as General Prittwitz had feared, now stood poised to launch its own offensive into Russian Poland. But the psychological and political effects of Tannenberg reached far beyond the battlefield. For Russia, the defeat was a catastrophe that echoed through the entire military establishment. The myth of the Russian steamroller, the idea that Russia's sheer numerical superiority would inevitably overwhelm its enemies, had been shattered. The world had watched as a massive Russian army had been surrounded and destroyed by a smaller German force. The incompetence and disorganization of the Russian command structure had been exposed for all to see. Within the Russian military, the effects were even more devastating. Officers who had survived the battle returned with tales of chaos, miscommunication, and leadership failures. Soldiers who had escaped the encirclement spoke of comrades left behind, of units abandoned, of orders that made no sense. The morale of the Russian army, which had begun the war with enthusiasm and patriotic fervor, began its long, irreversible decline. The Tsar's regime, already weakened by political unrest and economic backwardness, had staked its prestige on military success. Tannenberg was not just a military defeat, it was a blow to the legitimacy of the autocracy itself. And there would be more defeats to come. For Germany, the victory at Tannenberg was an enormous propaganda triumph. The battle had not actually taken place at the historic medieval site of Tannenberg, where German knights had been defeated by Polish and Lithuanian forces in 1410. The fighting had occurred around the towns of Allenstein and Hohenstein, miles away. But the German High Command, recognizing the symbolic value, officially named the battle Tannenberg, a deliberate choice to evoke the memory of that ancient defeat and to frame the victory as historical revenge, as the restoration of Germanic military glory. The name stuck. Tannenberg became a legend, a symbol of German military genius and invincibility. It was used to rally the home front, to convince the German people that despite the stalemate developing in France, Germany was winning the war. And what of the men who had commanded the victory? Hindenburg and Ludendorff became instant heroes, their names known throughout Germany and the world. Hindenburg, the elderly general recalled from retirement, became a symbol of Prussian military tradition and steadfastness. Ludendorff, the brilliant staff officer, became synonymous with operational genius and aggressive warfare. Their fame would only grow. After Tannenberg, they would win another great victory over the Russians at the Masurian Lakes just 2 weeks later, driving Rennenkampf's First Army out of East Prussia. They would be given command of all German forces on the Eastern Front. And eventually, they would come to dominate the entire German war effort. By 1916, Hindenburg would be appointed chief of the German General Staff, with Ludendorff as his deputy. Together, they would establish what amounted to a military dictatorship in Germany, sidelining the civilian government and the Kaiser himself. They would direct Germany's final, desperate offensives in 1918. And when those offensives failed and Germany collapsed, they would escape into legend, with Hindenburg eventually becoming president of the Weimar Republic. All of this flowed from Tannenberg, from those 5 days in late August 1914 when a Russian army marched into a trap and was destroyed. The battle did not decide the outcome of the First World War. Russia would fight on for another 3 years before collapsing into revolution. Germany would ultimately lose the war despite its victories in the East. But Tannenberg revealed fundamental truths about this new kind of industrial warfare. It showed that numbers alone were not enough, that armies needed effective communications, competent leadership, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. It demonstrated the decisive importance of intelligence. The Germans had read their enemy's mail and used that knowledge to devastating effect. And it proved that even in an age of mass armies, military genius could still achieve decisive, battle-winning results. For the 170,000 Russian soldiers who died, were wounded, or spent the rest of the war in German prison camps, Tannenberg was the end of everything, of their army, their hopes, and in many cases, their lives. For General Samsonov, it was the end of honor, a defeat so complete that death seemed the only escape. And for the German commanders who engineered the victory, it was the beginning of a legend that would shape German military culture for generations to come. A legend of tactical brilliance, of daring, of the triumph of will and intelligence over mere numbers. The Battle of Tannenberg, August 26th through 30th, 1914. 5 days that destroyed an army, created legends, and cast a long shadow across the Eastern Front for the remainder of the war. A masterpiece of military art, and a human catastrophe. The sheer scale of the German victory at Tannenberg was unprecedented. Over 170,000 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner or lay dead. The Russian Second Army was simply erased from the map. But the true legacy was the birth of a legend. This battle instantly consecrated Hindenburg and Ludendorff as Germany's saviors, a political and military partnership that would eventually seize control of the entire German war effort. For Russia, the defeat was a wound that would never truly heal, fueling the internal dissent that would eventually bring down the Tsarist regime. If you want to understand the monumental turning points that define global conflict, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and join the conversation below. We want to know, was this victory truly a stroke of genius, or was the Russian failure to use encrypted radio simply a gift the Germans couldn't refuse? Thanks for watching.